the big story at least the this week is what took place in Pittsburgh, but this followed on the heels of the identification and the arrest of the alleged MAGA bomber, Cesar Sayoc. He is a Florida man. He is obviously accused of sending pipe bombs. And I believe now we are up to close to 14 separate bombs that were sent to media outlets, to Democratic leaders and some members of the past administration. And apparently, according to the feds, he was intended to maximize harm to male targets by adding shards of glass in several of these IEDs, these pipe bombs. He also did internet searches for the wife and kids of several of his targets, including Eric Holder's wife and kids, John Brennan's wife and kids, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. And it turns out this guy basically had a bomb-making factory in his MAGA stickered covered van that was found. Somehow, I don't know, Donald Trump tried to pretend this guy was not inspired by him. He was at every one of his rallies. And to some extent, this shooting, this horrible shooting where 11 people were killed in a temple in Pittsburgh where a virulent anti-Semite went in and shot them with an AR-15 and two or three handguns. In some ways, in Donald Trump's mind, he was, I think, probably happy that the MAGA bomber was off the front pages, although, and we'll get to all of this, it's a lot to absorb at once, but while this white nationalist who shot up this temple felt that Donald Trump was not sufficiently white nationalist enough, he was acting on a narrative that was developed by the nexus of the Trump administration, Fox News Network. This is pretty scary stuff. And we're still a couple of days away from the midterm.
It really was. And it is exactly as you point out. It's of a piece. I mean, these things are not unconnected. And as much as Donald Trump would like to say that they have no connection to him, I mean, he even was very, he said, well, I understand that, I'm talking about the MAGA bomber, I understand that he preferred me over some others, but, and he went on. No, he didn't just prefer Donald Trump. He worshiped Donald Trump. This guy was a super fan. He was, and there's been a lot of reporting. It's very interesting to see because I think he may be, maybe an extreme version, or maybe they're a lot more like him. I don't know, of the radicalization of people under the thrall of Donald Trump. There's something about this guy on the cult leader, cult of personality level that inspires people like this. I mean, that remember the line that Selena Zito, that terrible phony writer on the right, who said that the left takes him literally but not seriously, and the right takes him seriously but not literally. These people, like that guy, are both. They take him seriously and literally. And this guy, Cesar, the MAGA bomber, he basically was completely enthralled to Donald Trump, and as a result, luckily he seems to have been fairly incompetent in his bomb building, but nonetheless, we don't know what could have happened. And one thing I haven't heard anybody think about or suggest is whether or not this the anti-Semite who went in several days, I think it was the next day after this guy was arrested, the MAGA bomber was arrested. He went in and shot up this synagogue in Pittsburgh. I mean, what's the connection there? I don't know if there's any, but all of this stuff was in the press. It was churning around. I mean, maybe he was inspired by that guy too. Who knows? That it was time to take action. That people are moving. Let's get this thing. Let's get this thing going. And all of that is coming from the rhetoric of Donald Trump. And the things that they have in common are listening to his words. and taking them seriously. And what he said that inspired that shooter in Pittsburgh, this guy who obviously was sort of an old school anti-Semite. I mean, his stuff goes, it's Stormfront level,
Right.
Nazi level Jewish hatred. But nonetheless, what inspired him at that moment was the idea that this caravan of Central American, people coming to claim refugee status allegedly in the United States and some in Mexico, that those people fleeing their country, that all of that was being sponsored and paid for and arranged by this Jewish cabal, which is, has become part of that whole story. And even Trump was kind of indicating, he mentioned Soros on the trail, George Soros, the liberal funder. And this is all part of the same thing. And Donald Trump doesn't want to admit that, but everybody can see it. Well, I shouldn't say everybody. His people can't see it. But, I mean, this is very scary. It's an escalation into a level of violence that can be traced directly to the man with the biggest megaphone in the world. And, he is a demagogue. We know that. And I don't think, I think there's a sense sometimes with people that, that Trump, there he goes again, that kind of thing. This is serious. The words he speaks are serious. People are listening to him, and they're acting on those words. And, I think that, I don't know if this last week was a wake-up call or whether or not it's just another incident. It's so hard for me to tell because it's so overwhelming, and it's just a cascade of horror ever since he's been elected. But it really seems to me, I mean, what happened in that synagogue, the horror of that and the kind of recognition that this idea that someone with a political agenda would go into a place of worship and just mow down people because of their religion. I mean, we've seen it in mosques. We're seeing it, we've seen it in churches, although that's not necessarily the church. Well, it is. I mean, in Charleston, right? I mean, They went in and did it there. So, I mean, this is becoming this is becoming something that is happening in this country on a sort of systematic basis, and we have a man in the White House who is encouraging it, basically. So I don't know if it's a sea change or some kind of a, people say inflection point or whatever, but it sure feels like something shifted a little bit.
I'm not convinced it's an inflection point, but I will say this. All you need to do is search what Nikki Haley said in the wake of that shot. I mean, we'll do a thing one, thing two type of thing here. But what she said in the wake of what happened in Charleston was that Donald Trump's rhetoric, she blamed his rhetoric in some regards to what happened in Charleston. Now, she's changed her tune now that she realizes that she's on board the Trump train. But at the time, even in Charleston, she thought it was a function of what he was saying. All right, look, we got to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about this because I think there's a lot more to discuss. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We're talking to the great Heather Parton. You may know her as Digby.